Welcome to the strange and haunting world of royal bloodlines, where noble families married not for love, but for lineage, where kings and queens looked not outward to form alliances, but inward, into their own family trees. This is where our story begins, with a question: why would powerful empires choose to marry cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, even brother to sister? The answer: pure blood. For centuries, monarchies in Europe and, earlier in Egypt, believed that royal blood was sacred, divine, something granted by the gods, and therefore, it had to be protected, preserved, not diluted by commoners. And so, kings married their cousins, queens gave birth to nephews, daughters were betrothed to their own uncles, all in the name of dynastic continuity. But this obsession with purity came at a terrible cost, a hidden cost, and it was often paid not by the kings who issued orders from their thrones, but by the women who were forced to carry this twisted legacy in their wombs. In the royal courts of Spain and Austria, family trees became twisted knots. The infamous Habsburg dynasty, desperate to maintain their political grip on Europe, practiced inbreeding for over 200 years. The result: children born with severe physical deformities, fragile immune systems, and minds clouded by madness. Yet the practice continued generation after generation. In Egypt, centuries earlier, the pharaohs took inbreeding to an even darker level. Rulers like Cleopatra VII weren't just marrying cousins, she married her own brothers, because the blood of a god, they believed, must stay within the same family. But this so-called divine strategy, it produced dynasties haunted by disease, early deaths, and dynastic collapse. Throughout all of this, one truth remains clear: women were the vessels of empire. They were married off like chess pieces, expected to produce heirs regardless of the risks. Their bodies endured the cost of incestuous unions. Their minds suffered under the weight of isolation, infertility, and history rarely speaks their names. In this chapter, we uncover the origins of royal inbreeding, not as a biological mistake, but as a political decision, one built on fear, pride, and the illusion that bloodlines could remain pure even as empires rotted from within. Welcome to the curse of blue blood. Joanna, the mad love, obsession, and madness. She was born into power, but inherited a bloodline that would betray her from within. She was a princess of Spain, daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, two monarchs who united a kingdom and expelled an empire. Joanna was royalty by birth, but destiny had other plans. She would not be remembered as an empress, a ruler, or a queen in her own right, but instead, as a woman gripped by madness. Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But was she truly insane, or was she simply a victim of a dynasty that demanded obedience, even if it destroyed her mind? Joanna of Castile was born in 1479 into the powerful Trastamara bloodline, a family already riddled with signs of instability and obsession. Her grandmother had shown signs of paranoia. Her cousin, Prince Carlos of Vienna, was said to suffer from deep melancholy. But Joanna, she was brilliant, educated, multilingual. No one expected her to break, until she fell in love at age 16. She was married off to Philip the Handsome of the Habsburg dynasty, a union designed to strengthen Spain's alliances. But for Joanna, it wasn't just a political arrangement. She fell deeply, completely in love with her husband, and that love would become her undoing. Philip was charming but unfaithful. His affairs devastated Joanna. She became possessive, jealous, emotionally volatile. But were her breakdowns the result of madness, or simply a woman unraveling under betrayal, isolation, and a marriage that was never truly hers? As her husband continued his affairs, Joanna spiraled. There are stories of her attacking her husband's mistresses, of refusing to eat, of sleeping beside Philip's embalmed corpse for weeks after his death, refusing burial because she believed he might come back. But these are court rumors told by men who had everything to gain from declaring her insane. You see, Joanna was not just a grieving widow. She was the legitimate heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. If she was declared mentally unfit, the crown could pass to someone else, and that's exactly what happened. After Philip's death, Joanna was imprisoned by her own father, King Ferdinand. Then later, by her own son, the future Charles V. For 46 years, she was locked in a convent, hidden from the world, her throne, her freedom, and her voice. All taken not by madness, but by politics. Modern historians believe Joanna may have suffered from bipolar disorder, depression, or even inherited genetic instability from generations of dynastic inbreeding. But whether she was mentally ill or simply emotionally overwhelmed, one thing is certain: she was a woman sacrificed to power, trapped between love and duty, caged by the very bloodline that birthed her. Joanna of Castile, a queen in name, a prisoner in life, and a warning from history that sometimes the real madness isn't in the woman, it's in the world that refuses to let her live. She was born between a throne and a cage, noble in name, but powerless in fate. History remembers kings, conquerors, empire builders, but behind every crown was a woman, chosen not for her voice or vision, but for her womb. Maria of Austria was one of them. Born in 1528, Maria was the daughter of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled over a vast Christian empire. And yet, for all his power, Charles made the same choice his ancestors had made for generations. He married his cousin, and when it came time for Maria to marry, the pattern repeated. She married her first cousin, Maximilian II, a union that was not based in affection, but obligation, because for the Habsburg dynasty, blood mattered more than love. The Habsburgs were not merely royals. They were obsessed with maintaining their lineage, believing that purity of blood meant purity of rule. But this so-called purity became a poison. But Maria gave birth to 16 children. Only 9 survived infancy. Many suffered from fragile health, developmental issues, and emotional instability, echoes of the dynasty's growing genetic crisis. One of her sons, Don Carlos, became a tragic symbol of what inbreeding could do to the mind. He was violent, erratic, and eventually imprisoned by his own father. Other children were married off to cousins, uncles, and nieces, extending the web of incestuous alliances even further. Maria herself was quiet, dutiful, and deeply devout. She lived most of her life in the shadows, standing beside Maximilian as empress consort, never challenging the system that used her. But her letters reveal the portrait of a woman who understood the weight of her role. She grieved each lost child, she watched her surviving children suffer, and she could do nothing to stop the machine that consumed them. When her husband became Holy Roman Emperor, Maria became one of the most powerful women in Europe in title only. In truth, she was a vessel, for blood, for heirs, for a family that was slowly folding in on itself. And when Maximilian died, Maria retreated to Spain, where she lived in religious silence, dressed in black, clinging to prayer, watching the dynasty continue its slow descent. Maria of Austria did not die in battle. She did not cause scandal. She did not even speak loudly, but she lived and suffered at the center of a dynasty that believed power could be preserved through shared blood, even if it meant sacrificing generation after generation of women. She was a daughter, a wife, a mother, a witness to tragedy, not caused by fate, but by design. This is the forgotten sorrow of Maria of Austria. The Habsburg horror, women of the jaw. They called it a dynasty of power. History remembers it as a dynasty of deformity. Look closely at the royal portraits. Sharp noses, narrow eyes, and then, a jaw. Too large, too long, too unnatural. That was the signature of one of Europe's most powerful bloodlines, and one of its most disturbing legacies. This is the story of the Habsburg jaw, a physical deformity passed through generations of royal inbreeding. But beyond the paintings and medical journals, it's also the story of the women who had to carry it on their faces, in their bodies, and through their sorrow. For over 500 years, the Habsburg dynasty ruled much of Europe, Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond. To preserve their empire, they kept their marriages in the family. Uncles married nieces. First cousins wed each other, again and again and again, and nature took notice. The most infamous sign of this genetic entrapment was the mandibular prognathism, or as history calls it, the Habsburg jaw, a jutting lower jaw, misaligned teeth, thick lips, speech difficulties. By the 1600s, it had become grotesquely visible in the ruling elite. But this wasn't just cosmetic. Recent genetic studies have confirmed what history suspected. The Habsburgs had one of the highest inbreeding coefficients ever recorded in royal history. And the women of the family, they bore the quietest and most painful symptoms. Take Margaret Teresa of Spain, often depicted as a tragic doll in grand Baroque paintings. She was beautiful in her youth but, married to her uncle, she died at just 21, after multiple pregnancies and stillbirths, her body weakened by a gene pool collapsing in on itself. Or Maria Anna of Spain, who married her own uncle as well. She suffered from severe scoliosis, infertility, and what court letters described as melancholia. But the royal court didn't see her as sick, only as disappointing, because a woman's worth was in her ability to produce heirs, no matter the cost to her health or mind. Even those who looked healthy on the outside, like Isabel, Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip, too struggled silently. She suffered repeated miscarriages, was often confined to bed, and died childless. Their husbands continued the cycle, but the women broke under it. Behind closed palace doors, physicians whispered of bad blood, yet no one stopped, because the empire had to go on, and the price was paid by young girls married at 14. by women bleeding out in childbed, by mothers watching sickly children die, one after another, and by queens, who wore crowns above the same jaw that had come to symbolize a genetic tragedy. The Habsburgs wanted to keep their power pure, but instead, they created a biological time bomb. By the 18th century, it exploded. Their line ended with Charles II of Spain, a man so deformed and cognitively impaired, he could barely chew, speak, or sire an heir. His jaw was so large, he couldn't fully close his mouth. His autopsy revealed only one shriveled testicle and a body, riddled with failure. He was the final product of a dynasty that had confused bloodline with destiny. The Habsburg women weren't just royal, they were sacrificial. Born into a gilded nightmare, bred for thrones, but buried in silence. They smiled for portraits, they wore silks and veils, and underneath, the jaw told a different story, that this was the horror they could not hide. Cleopatra, beauty, power, and her own bloodline history remembers her for her lovers. It forgets the brothers she married. She is a name that echoes through time. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the seductress of Caesar, the lover of Mark Antony, a woman remembered for her wit, her power, and her fatal romance. But before the scandals, before the warships, there was something far more disturbing written into her life. A royal bloodline so obsessed with itself, it turned inward. Again and again, that this is not just the story of Cleopatra. It is the story of a dynasty that married itself into madness. Cleopatra VII was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, rulers of Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. But the Ptolemies were not native Egyptians, they were Greek conquerors, and they governed with one unshakable belief. Only a Ptolemy could rule with a Ptolemy. They did not marry for love. They did not marry for alliances. They married their siblings, again and again and again. Cleopatra's own family tree is a labyrinth of incest, her parents, likely brother and sister, her marriage, to her two younger brothers in succession. She became queen at just 18, forced to marry her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII, when he challenged her authority. Civil war broke out, his body washed up in the Nile shortly after. Then came Ptolemy, 14, another brother, another husband. He died in mysterious circumstances, likely poisoned by Cleopatra herself. All in the name of sovereignty. So why did they do this? Because to the Ptolemies, foreign blood was corruption. They believed divine rule came from preserving their lineage, even if that meant marrying their own siblings. And Cleopatra, she may have been many things, but she was first and foremost a product of that system. Yet despite the inbreeding, Cleopatra was brilliant. She spoke 9 languages, studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and unlike her Greek predecessors, she actually learned the Egyptian language, making her more connected to the people than any Ptolemy before her. But the price of her throne was steep. She had to manipulate, seduce, and survive in a bloodline that was collapsing under its own weight. Modern scientists and historians believe that the generations of incests weakened the Ptolemaic line, producing rulers who were childlike, paranoid, and in some cases, mentally unfit. Several of Cleopatra's ancestors were known for violent outbursts, instability, and grotesque health problems. Cleopatra may have been the last flower of a dying vine, beautiful, brilliant, intoxicating, but rooted in soil poisoned by centuries of incest. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just romantic, they were strategic. She was trying to break free from the Ptolemaic cage, to bring new blood, new power, into her line. But history had other plans. After her death by suicide, likely by snakebite, her children were hunted down. Her dynasty, 300 years of rulers who married their own siblings, died with her. So the next time you hear her name, remember, Cleopatra wasn't just a seductress. She was a survivor, a queen born of incest, ruling in a world that demanded her obedience and punished her brilliance. She wasn't just fighting Rome, she was fighting her own blood. Queen Victoria's granddaughters, hemophilia, and the royal scandal. She gave Europe her blood, and it came back to haunt her. She was called the grandmother of Europe. By the end of her life, her descendants sat on the thrones of Germany, Spain, Greece, Norway, Sweden, and Russia. She gave birth to empires. But Queen Victoria's blood carried more than power. It carried a silent disease, one that would shatter her legacy, curse her granddaughters, and help bring down one of the greatest monarchies in history. This is the story of hemophilia, the so-called royal disease, and the women who passed it on. Queen Victoria of England had 9 children. Among them were daughters, princesses, married off to kings and kaisers across the continent. But unknowingly, Victoria carried a genetic mutation on her X chromosome. It caused hemophilia, a condition where the blood fails to clot, meaning that even a small bruise or cut could lead to internal bleeding and death. Her sons, like Prince Leopold, bled from the slightest injury. He died young. But the most devastating part, Victoria's daughters were carriers, healthy themselves. But passing the mutation to their sons, this wasn't just a genetic condition, it was a dynastic time bomb. Enter Princess Alix of Hesse, Queen Victoria's granddaughter. Filshy, deeply religious. She married the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and became Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. When her long-awaited son, Alexei, was born in 1904, the empire rejoiced. A male heir, at last. But their joy quickly turned to dread. Alexei had hemophilia. The boy was fragile, constantly on the edge of death. He bruised easily. Internal bleeding episodes would leave him screaming in pain. There were no treatments, no cures, only prayer and desperation, and in that desperation, Alexandra turned to a strange and dangerous figure, Grigory Rasputin, the mystic healer. Rasputin claimed to ease Alexei's pain. Sometimes he did, whether by spiritual calm or pure coincidence. His presence seemed to help, but Alexandra's dependence on him became an obsession. She kept him close, let him influence court decisions, allowed him to whisper in the ear of the Russian empress, and the people noticed as Russia entered. War and starvation swept the streets. The public saw Rasputin as a symbol of royal corruption, and Alexandra, once seen as a holy, elegant figure, became a hated foreigner, accused of treason and witchcraft. No one knew about the hemophilia. No one knew that behind the secrecy, there was a mother desperately trying to keep her only son alive. But it didn't matter. Whispers became riots. Distrust turned into revolution. In 1917, the Romanov dynasty fell. By 1918, the Tsar Alexandra and their 5 children, including the bleeding boy, were executed in a basement by Bolsheviks. The age of empires had ended, and it ended, in part, with a single faulty gene. Hemophilia would go on to affect other royal houses, Spain, Prussia, Hesse, but nowhere was the price higher than in Russia. Queen Victoria's bloodline stretched across Europe, but her legacy was not just thrones or treaties. It was a disease hidden in silk cradles, a curse whispered between mothers and midwives, a mother's grief buried beneath diamonds. The royal disease didn't just destroy bodies, it toppled dynasties. The sad fate of Infanta Margarita, her portraits, she stands regal and glowing. In reality, she was dying by design. She's one of the most famous children in art history. Her face appears in over a dozen portraits, dressed in lace and pearls. Golden curls framed like an angel. She was the darling of the Spanish court, immortalized by Diego Velázquez in Las Meninas, a symbol of beauty, youth, and royal innocence. But behind the canvas, there was something far more fragile. This is the story of Infanta Margarita Teresa, of Spain, a girl born into one of the most inbred dynasties in European history, a princess trapped in paintings and in blood. Born in 1651. Margarita was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his second wife, Mariana of Austria, who was not only his queen, but also his niece. Yes, Margarita was the product of Uncle Nie's marriage, a union meant to preserve the Habsburg bloodline. But what it preserved, more than anything, was genetic decay. Margarita was described as bright, sweet, and delicate, but she suffered from physical frailty and likely inherited early signs of the Habsburgs' deformities, including joint stiffness, a narrow face, and spinal irregularities. Still, the court adored her, or rather, it adored what she represented. From a young age, she was used as a political symbol. Her portraits were sent to royal courts across Europe, not as art, but as advertisements. Look at our princess, they said. She is young, she is noble, she is ready to be wed, and her bridegroom would be her uncle. At age 15, Margarita was married to Emperor Leopold I, her mother's brother. He was 26. She was still a child, but to the Habsburgs, love and consent had no place in a marriage forged by blood and politics. She left Spain for Austria, a cold, distant court where she knew no one. Her health declined rapidly. She gave birth to 4 children, only one survived infancy. By the age of 21, Margarita was dead. Her body, exhausted by childbirth and weakened by a gene pool collapsing in on itself, simply gave out. She was buried in Vienna, thousands of miles from the court that once displayed her like a living jewel. And yet, in the Spanish royal palace, her painted image lives on. Velázquez painted her not just as a child, but as an ideal. The innocent face of a dynasty built on incest. The fragile mask of a system that destroyed its own daughters in the name of legacy. Margarita looked perfect in oil and canvas. But perfection, in the Habsburg world, was a lie. She didn't rule. She didn't rebel. She didn't even survive. But she did what was expected of her. She smiled for the painter. She married the uncle chosen for her. She died young, quietly, completely, forgotten by history. Except, for the portrait. Infanta Margarita Teresa, a child, a bride, a sacrifice. painted into immortality. I raced in life. The Austrian brides raised to marry cousins, their dresses were sewn with gold, but their futures were stitched with sorrow. In the heart of imperial Vienna stood the Habsburg Palace, where music echoed through marbled halls, and daughters of empire were raised like porcelain, educated, disciplined, adored, but not free. They were the daughters of Empress Maria Theresa, the only female ruler of the Habsburg Empire and one of history's most determined dynastic architects. She had 16 children, 11 of them girls, each one a political asset, each one trained for one purpose: to marry a cousin, an uncle, or a foreign king, and seal an alliance. Among them was Marie Antoinette, the most famous, but she was only one of many. Her sisters were sent across Europe like beautifully wrapped parcels: Maria Carolina to Naples, Maria Amalia to Parma, Maria Josepha nearly sent to France before dying of smallpox. Each one raised in courtly ritual, each one told from girlhood, your duty is to marry your blood. To the Habsburgs, marriage wasn't a sacred bond, it was a transaction, a contract of power, and often a mirror of the past. Many of these women were paired with cousins, sons of Habsburg or Bourbon bloodlines, often descending from the same grandparents or great-grandparents. The gene pool narrowed, and so did their choices. Some were married to men decades older, some to cousins with known mental or physical disorders. But refusal, not an option. Marie Antoinette was sent to France at age 14 to marry the Dauphin, her distant cousin, and future Louis XVI. She didn't speak the language. She had never left Austria before, and she would spend the rest of her short life trapped in Versailles, ridiculed, isolated, and eventually executed. She was a political gift, and when the tides turned, a political scapegoat. But her sisters fared no better. Maria Carolina, married to King Ferdinand of Naples, her first cousin was plagued with miscarriages and court conspiracies. Maria Amalia, deeply unhappy with her arranged match, begged her mother to cancel the wedding. Maria Theresa refused. You are a Habsburg, she told her daughters. You do not choose. These women were born with jewels in their cradles, but their lives were not their own. Their bodies were vessels for dynastic continuation. Their minds, often brilliant, were confined to etiquette manuals and baby names. The emotional toll was immense. Letters from these women show loneliness, depression, and a quiet desperation to return home, a home they would never see again. They wrote to their mother, not with affection, but obedience. They spoke of distant husbands, dead children, political tension, and through it all, they were told to endure, because endurance was the one virtue expected of a Habsburg bride. They were called archduchesses, queens, empress, but in truth, they were hostages of empire. Their bloodlines were sacred, their suffering, irrelevant. They weren't raised to dream, they were raised to marry, to conceive, to obey. This is not just the story of Marie Antoinette. It is the story of a generation of Austrian daughters, sent out into the world not as women, but as living treaties. Isabel of Bourbon, a royal womb for Spain. She gave everything a dynasty demanded: her body, her children, her life. And, still, it was never enough. In the cold, echoing halls of the Spanish court, queens did not rule. They did not fight wars. They did not shape policy. But they had one sacred duty: to give birth, 2 sons, 2 heirs, to a future for the crown. No woman embodied this burden more than Isabel of Bourbon, the French princess who married into Spain's most cursed dynasty, and whose body became the empire's sacrificial altar. Born in 1602, Isabel de Bourbon was the daughter of King Henry IV of France and Marie de Medici. At the age of 13, she was sent across the Pyrenees to marry her cousin, Philip IV of Spain, a deeply devout and emotionally distant man. Their marriage was a strategic alliance between 2 Catholic superpowers. But for Isabel, it was a life sentence, as Queen Isabel's purpose was clear: produce an heir. Then another, and another. She became pregnant 14 times. Yes, 14. But, one by one, her babies slipped away. Most were stillborn. Some died within days. Only 2 survived infancy. And just one son, Balthasar Carlos, lived past childhood, only to die suddenly at age 16. Each loss broke a piece of her body. Each funeral tore through her spirit. But the court did not grieve with her. They waited for the next pregnancy, the next possible heir. Isabel was exhausted, often bedridden, and grew increasingly depressed. Her health deteriorated with every birth, but her value was tied to her fertility, not her well-being, and as she suffered in private, her husband Philip IV found comfort elsewhere, with mistresses, affairs, and illegitimate children born. While his queen mourned alone, still, Isabel endured. She performed her public duties with grace. She sponsored the arts, supported the poor, and remained deeply religious. But behind her elegant facade was a woman unraveling under the weight of repeated childbirth, mourning, and dynastic failure. Because in the Habsburg world, a queen who could not deliver sons was a silent catastrophe. Isabel died in 1644, at the age of 41, likely from complications of childbirth and long-term physical decline. She was buried with royal honors, but her legacy was quickly overshadowed by a deeper crisis. Philip had no heir, and the Habsburg line, already weakened by inbreeding, war, and infertility, began to crumble. Isabel's successor, her niece, another Habsburg, even younger, even more fragile. The cycle continued. Isabel of Bourbon is rarely mentioned in history books. Her name is overshadowed by her husband's reign and her son's brief life. But if we look closer, we see her not as a passive queen, but as a woman who gave everything for an empire that only valued her womb. She carried the crown's future in her belly and buried it with her babies. Again and again, she was a queen. But more than that, she was a mother. And in the court of Spain, that was both her purpose and her prison. Eugenie de Montijo, the last empress with Habsburg blood, she was born into fading nobility. But the ghosts of her blood still ruled her life. By the mid-1800s, the great monarchies of Europe were trembling. The thrones were still gilded, the titles still grand, but the people were growing restless. Empires were crumbling not only from war or revolution, but from within. And standing at the very edge of that collapse was Eugenie de Montijo, a woman born of beauty, brilliance, and blood that had been cursed for generations. She was the last empress of France, and in her veins flowed the final echoes of the Habsburg dynasty. Eugenie was born in 1826 in Granada, Spain. Her mother was a countess descended from both Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs. Through a web of noble marriages that had long since blurred the line between alliance and incest, her family, though aristocratic, carried the weight of history like a bruise beneath the skin. She was educated in Paris and London, fiery, intellectual, fluent in politics and philosophy. But no matter how modern her mind became, her destiny was still bound to the old world. In 1853, she married Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, a political union, but also one of strange poetic symmetry. The Bonaparte dynasty, born in revolution, the Habsburg legacy, built on blood, now bound together in a single woman. As Empress Eugenie became the face of imperial glamour, she dazzled at court, advised her husband, influenced fashion across Europe. But behind the silks and diamonds, she carried a deep loneliness and a fear that history was about to repeat itself. Eugenie gave birth to only one son, Louis Napoleon, the Prince Imperial. He was her pride, her obsession, her only heir. But he was also fragile, likely the result of centuries of aristocratic intermarriage and inherited weakness. And then, just like so many royal sons before him, he died, killed in 1879, fighting in a meaningless colonial war in Africa. At just 23 years old, he was speared to death in Zululand. Eugenie never recovered. By then, her empire had already fallen. France's Second Empire collapsed after the disastrous Franco-Prussian War. Napoleon III died in exile. Eugenie, once the most powerful woman in Europe, was now a widow, a mother in mourning, and a ghost of an extinct empire. She would live for another 40 years, wandering Europe in silence. She wore black for the rest of her life, not just for her husband and son, but for the entire world. She had once belonged to. Eugenie was not the victim of a violent court. She was not imprisoned like Joanna of Castile, nor forced into childbirth, like Isabel of Bourbon. But she was still bound by dynasty, by duty, by a genetic legacy that had shaped her life and taken everything she loved. She was the final flower of a dying garden. Elegant, rare, and utterly alone, Eugenie de Montijo, the last empress of France. The last whisper of Habsburg blood, a woman who watched history end, and lived long enough to remember what it once had been. They were queens, empresses, and brides. But history remembers their names, not their pain. In castles carved from stone and silence, dynasties ruled with an iron belief: power must stay in the blood. That belief built empires. But it also destroyed lives. For centuries, royal houses like the Habsburgs, the Ptolemies, the Bourbons, and the Romanovs married their cousins, their siblings, even their uncles, not for love, but for control. And in this cold arithmetic of bloodlines, one truth remained constant: women were the vessels. Their duty was not to choose, to question, or to dream, only to conceive, to bleed, and to bury their dead. This is the legacy of royal inbreeding, the deformities, the infamous Habsburg jaw, spinal disorders, fertility collapse, the diseases, hemophilia, that silently wiped out heirs across Europe. The madness from Joanna of Castile to the emotional unraveling of queens bred into cages. And yet, none of this was framed as cruelty. It was called tradition, purity, divine order. But behind these sacred justifications were girls, married at 12, pregnant at 13, widowed, exiled, forgotten. They were called infantas, archduchesses, empresses. But history rarely asked how they felt, only if they produced sons, only if they survived childbirth. Some, like Isabel of Bourbon, died in bed. Others, like Cleopatra, took their own lives. And many, like Maria Anna, died quietly, their names written only in funeral registries and family trees. Modern science now confirms what their bodies already knew. Generations of inbreeding led to genetic bottlenecks, to psychological trauma, passed through silent generations. to the extinction of entire royal lines. And yet even now, these women are remembered for their titles, not their torment. They were painted, but never heard, married, but never asked, crowned, but never free. This series is not just about history, it's about what we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget. These women were not tragic footnotes. They were the cost of empire, of legacy, of bloodlines that worship themselves. So, when you next walk through a museum and see a portrait of a royal bride, framed in gold, gazing softly outward, look a little closer. Behind the pearls and lace, you might just see the weight of a dynasty on her shoulders, and the sorrow of centuries in her eyes. This was their inheritance. This was their silence. From thrones to graves,